towards exiting the cave by speaking with the researcher and philosopher Per-Erik Milam. Per is a researcher at the University of Gothenburg, and he's currently working on a project called The Limits of Forgiveness, which is funded by the Swedish Research Council. Excuse me. I really liked the talk that Per and I had today. I attended a few weeks ago a talk he gave at Lewis and Clark College about letting go as an alternative to forgiving, which I found very interesting. And so I reached out and got him on the show. As well as letting go and forgiveness, Per also studies free will, agency, and moral responsibility, which I'm very interested in as well. So without further preamble, please enjoy my talk with Per-Erik Milam. Before we get started, I just want to say thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, of course. My pleasure.
So I guess, the way that I've kind of prepared for this is, like I mentioned, like I missed the first 15 minutes or so of the talk, but you were, you gave me these slides of a talk you gave at Lewis and Clark College called Letting Go of Blame, which off the bat is kind of two, letting go and blame are both these kind of like folk concepts that we have kind of floating around, but they, I think you would agree, are in need of a little bit of conceptual analysis. And so I was hoping to, both for like myself and the listeners, get caught up a little bit on that. So, when we say, well, actually, first of all, before I start asking you for definitions, I'm just curious, how did you get into, like the area of blame and specifically letting go? Because it's a very interesting and niche area of this, which is cool.
Yeah, I guess that's true. It is kind of niche in a way, although that's what Luke and I are hoping to make less the case. I should just say, by the way, for the record, this is a project that I'm doing with Luke Bruning. We've written some things together before. But yeah, so how did I get into it? Well, basically, I started, working on free will and responsibility and reactive attitudes. That's sort of what I wrote my dissertation on. And one of the things I was particularly interested in there was like, what's the value of the reactive attitudes? Like, what are they doing? And then I got interested in forgiveness as a part of that, but also for some other sort of background reasons having to do with my advisor, which we can talk about if you want. But yeah, so basically I got interested in forgiveness, and the more I thought about forgiveness, the more I thought, this might sound a little weird. Like, I do that very often? And, I thought, do I do that very often? Am I weird? Does anyone do it as often as it might seem, given like how much interest and discussion there is around forgiving, just like in academia, but also just like in everyday life, right? And so the more I thought about it, the more I thought there's a lot more going on here in our sort of ways of engaging and resolving moral conflicts than, blame, apology, forgiveness. Like that's, all those things are really important, but there's some other phenomena that aren't getting kind of quite as much attention as they might if we thought about what we actually do. And just an example of this, right? Like, so letting go is something you do. It's a way of overcoming or blame that's not forgiving, right? So I think if we think about circumstances where we find ourselves no longer blaming somebody, often those circumstances will be cases where we've let go. And, suppose you want to do a trip with friends, right? And it's COVID times. So you're like, okay, I want to be safe. I want to like have, all of you guys like be safe beforehand. And I want us to be safe during our trip, during our hangouts. And then I want you guys to be safe afterwards too, right? Like do a little like more self-quarantining. And then you show up and you realize like, one of your buddies has been going to the bar every other night because, they live in a state where things are open. And you're like, really?
Yeah.
So you blame them. You're like, come on, man, what the hell? But they're your friends and you want to have a good time. And, maybe that it wasn't like that risky or something like that, right? It's not so crazy that you're gonna like bail out on the whole
Yeah, yeah,
situation. But you're sort of pissed off, but you want to have a good time. And so you just sort of let it go. Like you let it go for the time, and just like try to like, minimize your risk in other ways while you're together. Maybe you don't even like bring it up to them, right? Like that could be really awkward. That could be kind of a bummer.
mm,
Like not to say that that's a good enough reason not to bring it up, but that's how it goes sometimes. And um, and afterwards, you continue letting it go. You're like, whatever. Like, I love these guys.
yeah,
These are my buddies. That sucked that they did that. It's kind of disrespectful. It's definitely blameworthy, but
mm,
so it goes. And for me, I realized that this happens more often than not, when I overcome blame, or when I find myself no longer blaming people, especially people I care
yeah.
about.
Yeah, I was gonna say like without because it's interesting. I mean, honestly, before, well, I guess I've thought about it a little bit because um, I did my senior paper on kind of more responsibility, reactive attitudes like this. So I've been thinking about this stuff for a while, but honestly, in terms of, I would not have been able to put it in the terms that you laid out, which I think are more helpful in terms of forgiving versus letting go explicitly. Um, and I guess I share your thought that I think I let go more than I forgive. Um, which you think you do that more often than forgiving as well?
I think so. I mean,
Mm,
if I had to like sit down and like catalog, I don't know where the
yeah.
tally would come, but yeah, it certainly feels so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it definitely feels like it, which is interesting. And so I guess just to be explicit, when you say blame, you are talking about one of what P.F. Strawson would call the reactive attitudes that we take towards someone when we view them as an appropriate target of our interpersonal reactions towards each other. So if you wrong me, um, I would blame you in a deeper sense than I would blame a car, for
Oh
just
yeah.
like if I park and I don't put my car in park and it rolls into me and it hits me, I'm not going to blame the car in a deep sense like I would blame you. So I guess that's to say blame is more than just attributability. It's an attitude that you would hold, towards someone.
Yeah, it's definitely an attitude. I also do think of it sort of in the Strawsonian or like the Wallace sense of like it being an affective response, right? So it's an emotion or it has a feeling component to it.
Hmm.
Um, I think like there's a lot of ways that people understand blame. I think what a lot of those are trying to capture like what are you doing over and above like appraising someone negatively or appraising someone as having failed morally,
Hmm.
uh, right? And like some people try to capture that with like additional judgments, others with like like what are you disposed to do or how is your behavior going to change. I think the best account is affective, yeah. So I think what you're
Yeah.
doing when you blame someone is you're having an affective attitude towards them, like anger or contempt or something. Yeah.
I mean, I think I agree with you because you could act, if, from like a consequentialist standpoint, you could act the exact same way towards someone, but you could, from the third person perspective, it's indistinguishable, at least potentially, whether you're blaming them or not, um, as opposed to maybe treating them with some sort of like kind of a social quarantine, view on them. So
Right. Right.
yeah, I think that makes sense, and especially for letting go. I think the act of forgiving versus letting go from a third person perspective could be indistinguishable, but it really matters kind of how you feel about the situation, right?
Yeah, definitely. So it could be indistinguishable from a third person perspective, like someone, viewing me and my buddies on vacation might be like, oh, he forgave them.
Hmm.
And they'd be reasonable in assuming that maybe. But yeah, the big difference is internal. But it's not just internal, right? It's something that a third person could figure out. They could be like, so, like, do you view them differently than you did before? And um, you might say, I mean, no. Like, I still think like everything they did was wrong, and that they were responsible, and that it was a shitty thing to do.
Hmm.
Um, but I just don't blame them for it anymore.
Yeah,
I'm over
yeah.
my blame.
And if someone were to say, you know, you would obviously still be able to know like who did it and what they did, but it's just you're not blaming them at that point, which makes sense. Um,
Yeah.
so how do you, I guess maybe explicitly spell out what you mean by letting go, because that could
Yeah.
sound deceptively simpler than it is.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It can seem simple when actually it's not as simple as it might seem. So, the core is just you're overcoming blame, but I think that the more you sort of think about it, and the more you think of it as a practice and not just something that happens passively, uh, it looks like it needs more of an account. It needs more of a positive story about it, in the same way that we give a positive story about forgiveness. And so, with forgiveness, I'm partial to a story in terms of reasons, right? I think the best way to describe what forgiveness is to say, what are the reasons for which we overcome blame?
Hmm.
Um, and I think that that's the best way to characterize letting go as well, is in terms of the reasons you have to let go of blame, right? So I think the main kinds of reasons that strike me as reasons to let go, as opposed to reasons to forgive, for example, are overriding reasons, right? So these are reasons where um, you say, it's just not worth it to blame because there are these costs to doing so. And there are always costs to blaming, right? Blaming doesn't feel good. Um, and there are various other costs as well. But it's a reason to let go when those costs are particularly burdensome or, uh, painful or whatever, right? So, like, um, blame can be painful when it's directed at someone you care about and you're sort of torn, right? Like, you think they did something bad, something wrong, but at the same time, like, it sucks to like feel negatively towards someone you care about. Um, there are other ways in which blame can be burdensome. It
Hmm.
can be burdensome to kind of hold someone to account, right? That's part of what you're doing when you blame, is you're holding someone to account. And, in the example I gave earlier, right? Like, one of the reasons we don't do it when we're hanging out with our friends and they do sort of minor or even sort of like moderate wrongs is it sucks to hold them to
Hmm.
account, to be like, even if you've got a good relationship, it sucks to sort of like put everything on hold and be like, nah, dude, stop doing
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
And again, that doesn't necessarily justify that. Like, sometimes you need to put the hold on, um, but but that's the reason why we don't do it, is because
Hmm.
it's burdensome. So I think that's one kind of reason for letting go.
Yeah.
Um,
I was just gonna say, I wonder. I was curious if you kind of share my intuition here. I feel like it's always a little bit of an emotional cost to blame, even if it's not people close to you. That there is some sort of like a gravity to it, in that sense.
yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so one way to characterize this might be like, people often talk about like the sting of blame,
Mm.
and that's sort of the hostile, sort of other directed part. That's negative. That's what makes it bad for other people, for the targets of blame. But yeah, it has a gravity. It has a significance
Yeah.
for yourself as well. I mean, part of this comes if you accept a sort of affective account of blame, right? Like, blaming is a negative emotion, among
Hmm.
other things. And negative emotions aren't good, they're negative. Um, so, it's not to say they're not important, it's not to say they're not valuable, but they don't feel good.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah,
think so.
the only kind of I don't think this is an exemption, but I was thinking about something like sports, where where, let's say, like I used to play like hockey in high school, and it, say a teammate of mine gets kind of like, illegally hit, right? And it, like, I kind of feel like this well up of like anger and blame. And like that, I guess that can be kind of motivating, if I direct it well, not take a penalty back, but just kind of maybe channel that into just playing as hard as I can. And maybe, I don't know. I'm hesitating to say that that's an exception, though. It seems like there's still like there's a weight to that blame, but it's just I can kind of manage to redirect that into a positive outcome.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And maybe the way I'd put it is that, like so many things in life, right? Uh, there's a positive feature that threatens to be a negative feature, right? So like
Mm,
I think sports is a fantastic example, and that the example you gave just rings really true to me from my time playing soccer.
mm,
But yeah, so you can imagine two scenarios where the same blame serves sort of different purposes. One, you do effectively channel it.
mm-hmm.
You use it to like play a little harder, play a little more aggressively, like um, control the ball or the puck or whatever better, make plays happen. But you can imagine another scenario where that's what you're trying to do, but it overwhelms you. And so what you really do is that you hit people harder, or you like
Mm,
make your tackles a little sloppier or a little
yeah,
more
a little
aggressive.
dirty, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you get a card. And this like I was smiling when you were giving your example because like I was thinking of a time playing, soccer in high school where exactly that thing happened, right? Like I got hit, and I got up and I chased the guy down and I went for a really hard tackle and it was
Yeah,
totally dirty. It was really bad. And I got a yellow card and my coach like called me over to the sideline while the game's still going. And it's
yeah.
like, no, that's not how we do it. That's not how we
Yeah,
do it. We didn't. That was not productive.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I've been both those
and
people before.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And there's some great examples from professional sports, right, where people like what for whatever the cause, like people melt down in their blame. There's some great examples from Serena Williams, right? You get a
Uh,
bad line call, you melt down, and you lose the match or you
yeah.
lose the set, and so it goes sometimes.
Hmm.
It sucks. Yeah.
What was that? There was that famous in the World Cup. His name starts with a Z. He was from South America. The headbutt. Um,
Oh, Zidane. He's
yeah.
French. Yeah.
Oh, is he French? Okay, I thought South America.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
This is
that's a
France versus
famous
Italy,
one.
2006. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, where he just it was like his opponent said something derogatory about his sister, right? And he gets up
Yeah.
and he
Yeah. Or his
headbutts
mom,
him.
something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember because it was like because the teammate was interviewed afterwards and he was like, no, no. He was like, I would never say something about his mom. Like I just called his sister like a whore or something. It's like so specific.
Could be.
It
Yeah.
was something
Yeah.
like that.
No, I'm sure. I'm sure it was the kind of dirty talk that like you hear often, but
Hmm.
maybe something about that moment like made it land particularly bad, or maybe like some people I think said that it was a racist comment or something like this.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know what it was, and I don't know if anyone other than the people right there know what was said.
True.
But whatever it was,
Mm.
Zidane, who'd been playing for a long time and who I'm sure had like had people say bad shit to him, uh, yeah, gets up and headbutts him. And I remember watching that in a bar and being like, "Whoa,
Yeah.
that just happened."
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's like a statue of the headbutt, I think, dedicated to somewhere in
is that right?
France.
Oh my
I think
God.
so, yeah. But
Oh
like, I
wow.
guess it's, this is like, I guess you could imagine this as like kind of a tension between letting go, because you can't like that seems like it's a clear instance in which forgiveness isn't really on the table. Like you don't have time to kind of just, work out the forgiveness. So you have a choice between letting go and not holding on. Um,
Mhm.
and I guess it's just like that would be right. Am I correct in saying that would be a quintessential overriding reason because it's too costly to hold on if you want to win the game, let's say he could have stayed in and gotten, a good defensive play or something.
Yeah, I think that's a quintessential case. I think there's going to be different kinds of this is going to
Mhm.
be a weird thing to say. I think there are different kinds of quintessential cases. I think, there's going to be cases where it's all in the moment. And there's going to be cases where it's more sort of over time.
Mhm.
But I think, yeah, that's an excellent example. It's a quintessential example of a sort of in the moment time where, you know, if you've been playing for a long time, if you're used to these kinds of scenarios, you're going to say to yourself, this is a moment for letting go. In the same way that, like, I think in a lot of sports, right, you sometimes have to say to yourself, this is not a moment to like blame myself for this
Mm,
like mistake I just made. That's less about moral blame. It's about non-moral blame. But like,
yeah.
this is a time when I need to like concentrate and not get in my own head about like having missed that shot or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. Just kind of don't fall into like the sunk costs or whatever. Like you missed it,
Right,
now just,
right.
you
Move it on.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then I guess your previous example then about the friend who doesn't quarantine before a trip could be one of more of a long-term example. Like you have kind of 2 weeks with them on the trip or whatever, and you have a few minutes of deliberation. You're about to get into the car or the plane or whatever, like with them, and you're just like, okay, like, look, what am I going to do? Ruin the trip right now? Like, I just, if I'm going to go on it, I might as well go on it and not need to hash this out on the car ride there.
Right.
Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
That's sort of what I was thinking. Yeah.
that makes sense. That makes sense to me. So I'm curious for the, because this is the first kind of reason to let go. So is the too costly, is that going to be spelled out for you uh, only in terms of consequentialist reasonings, whether it's kind of even just maybe personal or selfishly or on a larger scale?
I mean, I'm partial to consequentialism, so like I want to say yes, but there's
Hmm.
nothing essential to the story of letting go, or the overriding reasons to let go that needs to be understood in that way, right? So like, I think that thinking about overriding this is sort of like puts you in a consequentialist frame of mind, maybe.
Hmm.
And this kind of reason to let go really is about comparing like the different costs and benefits. But there's no reason why you can't think of it in moral terms that are a little bit broader,
Hmm.
right? So like, I think that there's a kind of overriding reason that is just moral reasons of a more general sort, right? So like, um, I might want to uh, I might want to overcome blame and let go, not for my own benefit, but for someone else's benefit,
Hmm.
just because that seems like the compassionate thing to do, right? Like they did me wrong, in, let's say, in some moderate way, but you know that sort of blaming or continuing to blame them will just be sort of devastating to them,
Hmm.
right? Maybe they, I don't know, are particularly sensitive to blame, or maybe they don't have a lot of like, supportive people in their life, and you're one of them. There's all sorts of things you might think of, and there, like, you could put that in consequentialist terms. You could say like, I should overcome blame because like the downside to me is less than the benefit to her or something like that. But I think it's more natural just to think of it in terms of like being compassionate, and you
Hmm.
have a good moral reason to be compassionate in that kind of circumstance.
Yeah, something like competing virtues, where there's like, the virtue of really correcting this behavior, kind of like, we got to deal with this now, versus the virtue of just preserving kind of the goodness of a situation for everyone involved, something like that. It's just more about
Yeah,
competing goods rather than um, anything wrong.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But I mean, I just think any sort of plausible moral theory should be able to spell out what's going on in an overriding reasons
Hmm.
case.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I was thinking about that, because you juxtapose letting go to forgiving, um, in that. Well, I don't, maybe spell this out further, because there's an aspect of letting go that you mentioned in the talk where you don't view the act as blameworthy, but you still view the person as blameworthy. Do I have that right?
Um, yeah. Well, so I think I think the right way to think about blameworthiness is that a person is blameworthy for an act, right?
Hmm.
So it doesn't make much sense to say that acts are blameworthy without any persons involved,
Hmm,
and those
sure.
persons need to be moral agents and morally responsible. Um, but yeah, I think that it's important that people are blameworthy for acts.
Hmm.
I also don't think it's not nonsensical like the other thing, but it to me it strikes me as a little strange to say that someone's just blameworthy as a person.
Hmm.
um, I mean, you can be blameworthy for your acts, you can be blameworthy for your character traits,
Hmm.
but just like a blameworthy person doesn't quite make sense to me.
What if you were using that as sort of a surrogate for just saying they were morally responsible? Like you could almost say that they were
Yeah,
blameworthy if they were to do something that would be incurring of blame. I mean, it's a
yeah,
weird,
sure.
yeah,
Sure. Like if you could say a person is a morally responsible agent. Yeah.
yeah,
And that when
yeah.
they do bad things, they're a blameworthy agent.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
But again, they're blameworthy in virtue of the stuff they do or don't do
Hmm.
or what have you. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You'd have to do something to even have kind of the possibility of blame on the table.
Yeah, or you'd have to, fail to do something that you should have done.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's where like character traits come in, right? Like if you are sort of a liar, you're a habitual liar, like that might be something you're blameworthy for also, not trying not to be a liar or trying to like lie less, things like
Hmm.
that.
Hmm. That makes sense. Um, okay, so those would be overriding reasons, and then you have
Mhm.
a another called resignation reasons.
Yeah, good. So yeah, a second category of reasons to let go are resignation reasons. And again, these are reasons where you think, look, blame's just not worth it. And in this case, it's not worth it because you think it's not going to be effective. It's not going to do what blame is meant to do or what blame normally does, sort of in our everyday moral repertoires, right? So I said earlier that part of what you're doing when you blame is you're holding someone to account. I think that's a pretty standard sort of view that people have developed from Strawson.
Hmm.
Um, you're holding someone to account, and sometimes, though, you know, your attempt to hold them to account with blame just is not going to work. And there are a variety of reasons why that might happen. I think Luke and I call them fragile contexts. There's a variety of kinds of ways in which a context can be fragile such that your blame's not going to land. It might be that, simple stuff, right? Like people are oblivious,
Hmm.
right? The person doesn't realize they've done anything wrong, or they're defensive,
Yeah.
where, when you call them out, they're just like not having it. And, the reaction is sort of a return accusation or something like that. They're just not engaging with you as a blamer. They're not taking uh, they're not taking you seriously. They're not taking the accusation seriously, or they're just rejecting it.
Hmm.
So those are some sort of basic ways in which blame may not land. But then there are also some more complex ways in which blame might not be effective, where you might have a resignation reason to let go. So one might be sort of cross-cultural circumstances where you're just not sure, right? Like whether you and the other person share enough moral ground um, to sort of have the blame. Michael McKenna has this idea of the blame conversation. The blame conversation is not. You might think the blame conversation won't go forward effectively because you don't know how much shared moral ground there is, and you might
Hmm.
be wrong about that. You might think that you're not going to make progress, but actually you could make progress. So it's something you could be wrong about. But there also might be just circumstances where, uh, here's an example maybe. I think this often happens in conversations about vegetarianism or veganism, right? Where like, sometimes you have a conversation where people are like, I understand where you're coming from. I disagree with you about this, this, and this.
Mm.
So that's why I'm not going to be a vegetarian. That's a totally reasonable kind of circumstance. And it's a circumstance where your blame is going to land, and then you're going to get a justification as a reason why you shouldn't blame them, right? So someone who has what they think is a good justification for eating meat. If I say you shouldn't eat meat, and I think that was really shitty that you ordered that hamburger, they might then give me their justification, and I should stop blaming them if I think it's a good justification.
Mm-hmm.
And even if, maybe even if I don't think it's a good justification, but I think that they're taking the issue seriously.
Mm.
But then there might be another circumstance, right, where like you say, I think it's wrong to eat animals. We shouldn't be like ordering meat at this meal. And the person's like, you know, I just don't buy into the idea that animals deserve moral concern whatsoever.
Mm.
And so we're engaged in some sort of like you're engaged in some sort of like fetishization of these animals when eating is natural. And you know, so you might think there's a line of argument here that could be made, but really it looks like we just are not sharing enough ground to have a productive
Yeah.
engagement about this right now. And so you might think your blame's not going to land. So that's a reason why you might resign yourself and let go. I mean, I'm a little bit unhappy with that example. I think I could have spelled that out better. Maybe here's another example. This is something that actually happened to me. So I once went with my partner to the house of a friend of hers, and while we were there, the mother of this family made this wonderful dinner, and it was incredible. And as we sat down to eat, we realized that, you know, what was going to happen was that the father in the family would sit and eat with us, with the kids, and the mother would continue serving us,
Mm.
and she would
Okay.
eat by herself later. And you know, I thought to myself, I don't like that. I think that's not a great sort of set of gender norms to have. But I certainly also thought at the same time, like, well, many things. One, like, I could be wrong about that. Like, maybe my judgment is mistaken here. But I also thought this isn't a time for blame, right? This is a situation where we have a context that's fragile in various ways, where you know, there are norms that are, you know, well established in
Mm-hmm.
these people's culture, and it would take quite a bit of hashing out to sort of make any of my blame useful.
Yeah.
And so I let go. So anyway, that's a kind of account. So that's another kind of resignation reason. And then a third sort of kind of resignation reason, a third kind of fragility that a context might have, is just where you think blame's not going to land, it's not going to be effective, basically because you're not taken seriously, right? You're not taken seriously as a blamer. And here, this might be because you're, you know, from a group that's sort of, you know, in an oppressed position in society, and their claims to certain rights are, you know, while nominally acknowledged, are not taken seriously in practice, or are taken less seriously. So I think there's some cool work by various philosophers talking about how this might happen. And you know, it could be any number of groups, but the case I'm thinking of is a paper by Sue Campbell about being dismissed and having your anger dismissed. In particular, she's interested in how your anger might be dismissed as bitterness,
Mm.
right? Which is based, like, when you read her paper and when you think about this phenomenon, you're like, oh yeah, sometimes if you're called bitter, basically what you're having done is you're having your anger written off as like inappropriate. So you can imagine circumstances like that, right, where you think your blame's not going to land because you're not taken seriously as
Hmm.
a claimant.
Yeah. And I feel like there can also be sort of blending cases between a lot of these. So like one that sprung to mind during your original talk was, for instance, my uh, one set of grandparents are extremely religious, like extremely conservative Christians. And when I was younger, because I was brought up in like an evangelical community too, and when I was younger, I used to kind of like hash more of this kind of stuff out with them, right? Because like just young, you have the energy for that, and you actually are naive enough to think that like your blame will connect. And now I've just it's almost like, and I guess it's sort of a blending between maybe the second and the third type of resignation cases you laid out, where it's like I sort of if they do something that's just like just obviously kind of just maladaptive or even like immoral to me, um
Hmm.
even if it's just like a remark or something, right? And I kind of like I bring this to the fore, like I bring it to their attention, and I try to have that hashing out with them. It's just like it's like this is why I'm curious if you view it too as like a blending between the second and the third type. Is it's just like I don't feel like they're in a mental space to have that conversation. But I also feel like, as someone who's non-religious now, it's almost like you're not in a position to be like taken seriously at that point. Like we're only concerned about the opinions of other Christians. Don't you understand? It's like that kind of a
Yeah,
thing.
yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
yeah.
Certainly. I mean, I think that can happen. I think that, one thing that human beings are really good at is like in group, out group stuff.
Mm,
And, you know, I can imagine exactly the circumstance you're saying where what you have is a sense that you're being dismissed, but maybe at the same time, a sense that, uh, yeah, maybe you're you've moved enough outside of the sort of cultural norms that you're not worried that you're worried that your blame won't land in that sense as well. Is that kind of what you
yeah,
were getting at?
yeah.
Kind of
It's
a
like
combination
yeah, there's
of
there's almost not
uncertainty.
enough overlap anymore. It's like you kind of
Yeah,
have to have
yeah.
a certain, your Venn diagrams have to overlap enough to kind of have the blame connect. And it just seems like there's kind of there's a lot of situations in life where you're almost, like to use the Watsonian language, you're almost in different moral communities at that point. Like the
Hmm. Hmm.
potential for moral address is almost just not there anymore. And honestly, it's like kind of both ways. Like I'm not sure I really take their moral opinion seriously anymore either.
Yeah, I think yeah, that seems very uh, real. That seems like a definitely a real phenomenon. And like I said, I think part of this, I think you're right to see these as sort of coming together sometimes, and maybe even reinforcing one another, right? Like,
Hmm.
um, the more you dismiss people, the more they're going to view each other for the next interaction as sort of being in separate spheres.
Hmm.
And that's going to make it easier to dismiss them in the future.
Yeah.
And, maybe you have something like a story of polarization right
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
And it's tricky too because a lot of this sounds rather negative, but I think that you paint a story, and I largely agree with it. That it's not that straightforward. Like if I mean, antiquated conservative Christian values really aren't what we want to be shooting for anymore. Like, it's not straightforwardly bad that I don't take those reasons seriously anymore. And you could make the argumentation that it's not straightforwardly bad that I don't just kind of wade into the blame morass every time it comes up. Like, you kind of have to, like, what are you going to do about it?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, at the most basic level, there's a sort of question of like where you want to spend your
Hmm.
both emotional and sort of cognitive energy. And, I think this probably isn't helpful for polarization, but at a certain point, you have to sort of say, I'm not going to engage with these people in this way. Um, and you also have to think like, not only am I not going to engage with them intellectually, I'm not going to just like do my arguments for, you know, secular morality or
Mm.
vegetarianism or what have you. But you also think I'm not going to do the blame part of this. I'm not going to do the moral. I'm going to stop blaming them in the sense that I'm going to overcome this anger that I have or this contempt that I have.
Mm.
I'm gonna let go of blame, in addition to sort of not engaging intellectually. Yeah, yeah, I think that that's right, and I think that there are good reasons for doing it. Um, but I also think that, you know, one thing I want to emphasize, right, is that I think letting go is valuable, not just because, you know, not just for because our relations can break down, but just because it's a way of dealing with a world that already exists in a particular way, right? And I think that that's an important thing to recognize when we're talking about how we deal with moral conflicts. You know, there's always been moral conflicts. There's always going to be moral conflicts, and there's always going to be reasons to let go and reasons to forgive.
Mm.
Um, and you know, sometimes you'll have the one, and sometimes you'll have the other. And I think, you know, in any sort of non-ideal world, you're going to have reason to let go sometimes, and that's going to be both valuable and even, you know, good or virtuous to
Mm.
do. It can be not just sort of a second best. It can be the best thing available and even the right thing to do. So
Yeah, it was.
I want to make sure that that's clear as well.
Yeah, definitely. Because I mean, you know, just kind of like introspecting on it, it honestly seems like letting go is often the required thing to keep some relationships intact. You know, at least sometimes. Like you couldn't exist in a state of like always letting go, but for certain scenarios, it seems like, I mean, at least for me, you know, in my interpersonal relationships, it does seem like letting go plays a crucial role in just like, I mean, you can't kind of just get to the bottom of everything, you know. I mean, on both
Mm-hmm.
sides of any relationship, you do just have to let go sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And you know, maybe this is an opportunity to mention one last kind of reason. I didn't really talk
Mm.
about this in the talk,
Yeah.
but it's something that Luke and I discuss in the paper, and that's that sometimes. So here's a third type of reason you might have to let go, and that's a sort of what we call alignment reasons,
Mm.
and that might be something like you let go of blame not because you've gotten an apology and the person has sort of said, um, you know, yeah, what I did was wrong. Sorry about that. It's not that they've already come back into alignment, but it's that you suspect that they will in some sense in the
Mm.
future, right? So like, or maybe you just have sufficient trust in them as a, you know, as a thoughtful and caring person that even if you don't think they'll necessarily come to the right attitude on this kind of behavior, that you know they're a person you want to be friends with, or they're a
Mm.
person you want to be in a relationship with. So I think that's a kind of reason to let go too, and that's not about resignation, and it's not about overriding this exactly. It's more about like you have some faith in the person, you have some trust, you have some sort of shared understanding that allows you to think of yourself as sort of broadly in alignment,
Mm.
and maybe as you know, likely to come back into alignment in the future,
Mm.
even without an apology, or even potentially without their recognizing that what they did in this particular case was wrong.
Yeah, I was smiling because you made me think of you know, just like, you know, one of my closest friends, you know, when sometimes we just have, you know, just like there's a little like, you know, hitch in the conversation, or like, you know, we're in a group setting and, you know, we're young guys, we kind of rag on each other and stuff. You know, sometimes it goes too far, sometimes it doesn't. And it's funny because like I'm just thinking of, you know, the closest friends I have is there's always that recognition of like when it goes too far, you almost like a lot of the time we don't even apologize because it's like, of course there's no need for it. Like, they know it's like, and when you do apologize, like, oh yeah, like it's like I wasn't even thinking about it anymore. It's almost like you're kind of broadcasting someone's potential or expected forgiveness into the future and then allowing that to kind of percolate back and realize to just let it go. They would forgive if I were to ask.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is so I think that's a really good description, and I think this is actually why it's one of the reasons why I'm a little bit tentative about fleshing out this third kind of reason. So these alignment reasons, because it really does shade into forgiveness in an
Hmm.
interesting way, right? Because you can also imagine a case, right? Just to use your example, right? You're ribbing your friends and like maybe it goes too far, but you can see immediately, like from their expression, A, that you've gone too far, and B, that they're letting it go, or that they've forgiven you, right? And part of that is just like, as humans, we're really good at like reading each other's facial expressions, right? Where like you can see in a second that you've gone too far, he can see in a second that you see that. And then you're good.
Yep.
And I think there's a case for calling some of those circumstances forgiving, actually, right? It's sort of instantaneous forgiveness because it's instantaneous recognition of remorse.
Hmm.
um, but I think there are also cases where what you have is letting go because you don't see instantaneous remorse, maybe, but you you have a sort of trust that there's enough. You know the person well enough. You know their character. You know what you can expect from them. You know what they care about, and what's important to them morally. Things like that. That you
Mm.
can count on them, sort of like understanding later, like and maybe they never come back and say sorry about last night or whatever, but they don't have to.
Yeah.
So it's something that on the one hand I'm a little bit hesitant about, right? Because there's this sort of fuzzy boundary between the two phenomena, um, but at the same time I do think that that's a reason to let go, and the kinds of scenarios we've been describing strike me as real.
Hmm. Yeah, it's definitely kind of the softest version of letting go, I would say. But I like the case though. I do like that description of it. Um,
Yeah.
it's interesting. Um, so I was curious about one because I know we're kind of coming up on the end of the time here, but I was curious about one remark that you made specifically in the presentation. You said, so this is kind of at the end of the talk, and you say, therefore, we need an ethics of letting go. And I was curious what you meant by an ethics of letting go.
Yeah, good. That's a great question. So basically, what I have in mind is something parallel to what, in the literature we call an ethics of blame or an ethics of forgiveness, right? So if you think of like these topics as philosophical topics, part of what people are interested in is what you might call the nature of the phenomenon, right? So like the nature of blame, the nature of forgiveness, the nature of letting go. And part of what we're doing in the paper is giving the nature of letting go and contrasting that with the nature of forgiveness. Just, knowing what it is, what the phenomenon is. But once you know what it is, if it's a moral phenomenon, if it's part of our moral lives, then we need an ethics of it in the same way that we need an ethics of lying and an ethics of promising and an ethics of, um, distributive justice, right? An ethics of charity. In the same way, we need an ethics of forgiveness and an ethics of letting go, because these are phenomena, these are practices that we do, and they affect the well-being of other people. They affect whether people can live good lives and flourish. And so when I say we need an ethics of letting go, what I mean is we need to think about when we should and shouldn't do it, basically,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that's important in a way for sort of obvious reasons. If one of the things that I can do by letting go is make my own life go better or worse, and make your life go better or worse, then I need to think about when I should let go. And I think it's we can see this especially clearly if we think about circumstances where we think it's important to keep blaming, right?
Mm.
Where we think it's really essential, whether socially or just interpersonally, that this person see, or this group of people see, that blame is the response to this kind of behavior, and that continued blame is the response to this kind of behavior. So, whatever we think those circumstances are, we need to have an ethics of blame to sort of identify those, and an ethics of letting go for knowing when that's an appropriate kind of response.
Yeah, because I was thinking about, it seems like it's always available to us to let go. That's kind of a live option for us. And I was thinking about the times where it might be an imperative not to let go, to continue blaming. And and I think it's kind of easy to imagine a lot of those scenarios interpersonally. But I was curious, I mean, do you have any kind of examples on hand of whether it's interpersonal or more societal where you think we ought not let go?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot harder in the interpersonal case because even the worst kinds of offenses, you might have good reason to let go. And it might be that your reasons to let go actually are amplified by the 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 badness of the offense, right?
Mm.
The strength of your reason to blame might be uh, the fact that the reason why you have a good reason to blame a lot might also be a good reason and a stronger reason to let go. Um, so I think the interpersonal cases are a little bit harder, right? Like I can imagine someone who, they're treated badly, right, with prejudice or hatred, and that fact is a strong reason for them to blame. But at the same time, it makes the reason to let go stronger too, because that sucks. And if you have no recourse, if you're going to be dismissed, if your blame's going to be dismissed, it might be just as strong a reason to let go. I think the social cases are better. It's a lot easier to come up with a case that's sort of unambiguously one where uh, you have an obligation or an imperative not to let go. And there, I think, you know, any case where the kind of injustice that you're seeing is one that is sort of uh, persisting, frequent, unaddressed, or sort of impervious to uh, to the different ways in which it might get resolved in society. So basically, this is just any circumstance where you think like this is something we have to take a stand on.
Mm.
So that might be, police violence. Um, it might be, Holocaust denialism or something like that, right? Like you can't let certain things stand unopposed. You can't let people not account for themselves on
Mm.
certain issues. Um, I think that's a plausible thing to say. Um, yeah, so I don't know. That's the kind of thing that
Yeah.
comes to mind.
Those kind of cases, came to mind too, but it strikes me that if you do take this kind of attitudinal view of blame, you might be able to let go, while continuing to perform the actions that would be kind of required. So for instance, if it's, Holocaust denialism, like I could really let go of my blame towards those individuals. They're just misled by information. They're not thinking straight.
Mhm.
Sure, there's some, just imbalance going on there of some sort, informationally or otherwise.
Mhm.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that I would have to kind of stop fighting the misinformation, or donate to counter organizations or reform organizations, or whatever it is.
Mhm.
I was curious what you thought about that.
Yeah, good. That's a good question. I mean, I think there's to a certain degree what I said about interpersonal cases is going to apply. Uh, it can apply in any case, right? it's
Mm.
it's always possible that letting go is the more appropriate strategy. Um, I think it's just more likely that it's social cases where
Mm.
the blame, sticking to your blame guns is gonna usually be more appropriate. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There are certainly circumstances where, as an individual, opposed to some practice or some feature of society that you see, um, that yeah, it's best to let go of blame. I certainly feel this a lot about political issues, right? Where, but what I mean by that is things that politicians do,
Mm.
the actions of politicians. I think simultaneously, the most likely I am to blame in any given day is to blame a politician for something I read about them doing or not doing,
Mm.
saying or not saying. Um, and at the same time, those are the cases where, for me, I'm most likely to let go because I don't have a, a voice that reaches them. Um, and where the cost to me, like being angry on Facebook all day, is too high, so I let go. So that's certainly the case, um, but yeah, I still do think that it's likely to be social issues, social causes, sort of socio-political problems where letting go is more likely to be wrong. Maybe that's
Mhm.
the way to put it.
Yeah,
But of
that
course,
makes sense.
none of them are all or nothing.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense to me. I was curious also because there was a question asked about this in your original talk, and it made me think about, and I think you alluded to it a little bit previously, but there's a question of whether letting go is an active or a passive process, and it seems to me like just phenomenologically, I very much can choose to let go. Like I just evaluate the situation. Look, like I should just let this go, and the process of letting go can actually be challenged by this like re-upping almost of kind of the like remembering the thing that made me upset, or just kind of thinking about it more, or even having the impulse to like kind of complain about it to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that uh, it's weird. I have the experience both ways. Like sometimes it's actually a very hard process to let go, and I almost have to actively like no, just kind of shut that impulse down to just keep re-upping the blame. And then other
Yeah,
times I can't even blame. Like I can't even get that intuition up and running. Do you? I think you share those both of those cases.
definitely. Yeah, I think certainly it can be the case that letting go of blame is hard in the same way that it can be difficult to forgive, right? Sometimes the blame, it sticks in your mind, you ruminate on it. I think cases of self blame or guilt are really good examples of this, right? Like you do some shitty thing and, it pops into your mind, every day or once a week or something like that, and you find yourself thinking about it. Um, but yeah, at the same time, there are also cases where you might say like you're not even sure you did blame. You can't be certain whether you just didn't blame or whether you let go of blame quickly or forgave quickly for that matter,
Hmm.
um, because it you just aren't sure what your full reaction was, because you slipped so quickly from one to the next step. Yeah, that seems totally natural as well.
Hmm.
Um, and I think there are probably lots of circumstances where if you were to say, what did you do in that circumstance? Did you forgive, your friend? Did you let go? Did you blame at all?
Yeah.
um, I'd say, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I the the circumstances where I'm not even sure that blame ever kind of like gets in the air, gets off the runway, are often with random people, just with interactions. Like it's weird that sometimes I mean, I'm not a person who really kind of gets like, road rage or anything. It doesn't really register to me, but it's weird that like, I mean, every once in a while I do, it's like, and it's weird.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, I don't know if this is just like lack of self-knowledge or what, that, sometimes it just, you don't even, blame doesn't even get registered, or someone just kind of, wrongs me in, I don't know, some like the workplace. It's not really a personal issue, or, it's just sometimes
Yeah.
the blame arises and sometimes it never even gets off the ground. I don't know. It's very odd.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think this is why it's important for people who try to give an account of what blame is to sort of explain what the holding against part is, right? Like
Hmm.
when you blame, you assess someone negatively, right? You view them as having, failed in some way, but you also hold it against them. That's part of what blaming is.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, sometimes you just don't hold it against them. You register it as a wrong, but you don't hold it against them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes traffic is like that. Sometimes it's not. Um, uh, Sometimes, yeah, workplaces are another good example. Yeah, I think this is an everyday sort of uh, sort of phenomenon. I think maybe the way to think about this last point is to think like, um, how would you re-describe it if you were thinking back on it? Do you endorse the blame you had,
Hmm.
or do you not endorse it anymore? Um, right? What are the if you think um, right? So that would be a way to tell whether you blamed or not. Is to just say like, well, do I blame people for things like that? Then probably I did, but you can never be sure. And likewise, to know whether you've let go, you might you might say, well, what kind of reason did I have, even if it didn't come to mind, even if it was just motivating me without sort of me taking it consciously into mind. Um, and if I think, you know, probably what I was doing was moving on in the sense of like distracting myself so that I wouldn't get bent out of shape in a way that, would be unpleasant. Then you think, yeah, seems like what I did was let go. Like I had an overriding reason and I sort of acted on that without thinking about it. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's a super fascinating. And I mean, I'm not in the field yet, hopefully, but it seems a little, not underdeveloped, but it's ripe for development. Is this turning into
Yeah.
a paper of any kind?
Yeah. This is a paper. It's under submission right now. But it's something that Luke and I are still thinking about, still working on. Yeah, I think I hope that it's a phenomenon that people both think is real and familiar and important, and then one that they think we've given a good characterization of. That's sort of the first step. And I think just to your point, there is a lot of work to be done here. Um, sort of just sort of getting clear on the phenomena, right? Because part of what's interesting about our moral lives is all of these sort of different practices and different phenomena that are part of our everyday lives that we don't sort of pick out necessarily, and that get sort of elided in conversations about other sort of
Mm.
topics that have a sort of stronger center of gravity, right? Like a greater mass in the intellectual space. And I think forgiveness is one of those phenomena that sort of it draws other things in, and you fail to sort of see differences. Um, but yeah, I think there's tons of cool work. I just read a paper last week about unforgiving, right? So withdrawing or
Mm.
taking back your forgiveness, which as soon as I thought about it, I was like, yeah, that's definitely a thing for sure. Why is this the first paper I've ever read about it? Or not literally the first, but one of very few papers I've ever read on the topic.
Mm.
So yeah, Monique Wonderly has this great paper, and my reaction reading it was like, yes, this is a paper that needed to be written.
Yeah.
Um, and I think there's plenty more out there. Hopefully, this one is one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I look forward to its hopeful publishing. before I let you go, where can people find out more about your work on this specifically, but just you generally?
Yeah, well, I've got a website, per-erikmilam.com, all one word. I can send you that so you can put it in show notes if you want. Other than that, fill papers, fill people. That's sort of, I think, the best resource for finding philosophers.
Yep. I'll leave the links to all of those in the description for people.
Cool.
Per, stay on the line, but thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that discussion. It was a really fun talk, and I really appreciate Per joining me for that. So, just in closing the show, like I said, I'll leave links to the descriptions of the links that Per mentioned in the description below. And of course, if you want to support this show, you can do so by visiting the links below on Patreon. You can also share this show, rate it on Apple Podcasts or on any player that you listen to. You can like or subscribe to this video on YouTube. You can discuss it on your own show, or you can contact me with either recommended guests or topics to cover at platoscavepodcast@gmail.com, and also on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers. And as always, thank you for listening, and keep struggling to escape the cave.